They all followed his leadership. They all identified with him, and that's precisely what he's saying. Entry into the church is by baptism of the Spirit. Entry into the assembly of the wilderness was by all coming through the sea, all being under the cloud, accepting Moses as the leader, as the Christian accepts Christ as the head. They were in identification as a nation, as a community, as a fellowship, as a believing, witnessing group under the headship of Moses. That's what it's saying. So, they were all identified with Moses. One corporate witnessing community. And as baptism brings us under the leadership of Christ, so did participation in the great events of the Exodus bring them under the leadership of Moses. Anybody who wanted to could have said, hey, Moses, I'm not going through that deal. I'm staying right here. And he would have cut himself off from that corporate community that was under the leadership of Moses. Now, that's the first thing. God liberated them, and then God identified them as a witnessing community. It's tantamount to the Christian being called by God to serve and united with the other believers who are the witnessing community in this age. Now notice there's a third blessing area, verse 3. And all did eat the same spiritual food. You say, what is spiritual food? That's the first question I asked. Spiritual food does not mean that it's sort of ethereal and you can't really see it. It's not talking about the essence of it. It's talking about, notice this, the source of it. Spiritual food is food that is coming from the Spirit of God. And when they were in the wilderness, who gave them their food? God did. By His Spirit, God delivered their food. They were sustained by manna. It is called spiritual food, not because its essence is spiritual, it was physical, but because its source was spiritual, the Spirit of God. So, they were all sustained. They were all given food and nourishment. And that also is like the Corinthians and like Christians. We have received the sustenance. My God shall supply all your needs. We are supplied by Him. He that eats this bread shall never hunger. He that drinks this water, said Jesus, shall what? Never thirst. We are sustained. So the parallel again is there. They all ate the same spiritual food, verse 4, and all drank the same spiritual drink. That is water that was provided from the Holy Spirit. Sometimes it came out of a rock. Sometimes there was a stream or a brook. Sometimes there was a well. But in many ways, God provided. Now, the verbs in those two are imperfect verbs. That doesn't mean they're less than perfect. That means they do not know completion. The word perfect means completion. So they are without completion, which means anything in the imperfect tense has successive continuity. They were continually being fed. There wasn't any completion. There wasn't any end to it. They were continually being given water by the Spirit. All through their wandering, all through their life, sustained by God. So you have a picture here of the believer who is called as a part of the corporate community, identified by baptism into that corporate community, and then sustained by God with all the resources necessary. Now that's the assets of liberty. It's a pretty good position to be in. But there's more. Verse 4 has a very interesting phrase that is not easy to understand. They all did drink the same spiritual drink. Now he adds this footnote, and it would have been a lot easier on a lot of folks if we had just left it out, because it's difficult, but we'll do our best to show you what we think it means. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. Now, there have been amazing explanations of this, but let's just get down to what really I think is the safest way to explain this. They drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. In the first place, what just thrills me about that statement is that it proves the pre-existence of Jesus Christ, right? Christ is following Israel through the wilderness. Second, the rock is Christ, and the rock is God in the Old Testament, which makes Christ equal to God. Tremendous statement. But look what its meaning is. What are they saying? The rock that followed them. You know, the Jews had an interesting legend, and I think that's where this comes from. It was a legend that was in existence still at the time of Paul. This was what they thought. The old Jewish legend said that originally in Exodus 17, I think it is, remember when God said, I'm going to give you water out of the rock, Moses, take your rod and strike the rock, and he did, and it just gushed out water and satisfied the thirst of, there must have been 1 million or better people. And so that rock, according to the old Jewish legend, took off from there and rolled behind Israel for the rest of the 40 years. Wherever they went, the rolling boulder was there, just following them along. And they'd stop, and the rolling rock would be there, and whatever, speaking or hitting, gush out water. The old Jewish legend that the rolling rock accompanied them for 40 years, always yielding its water. I think that Paul, in a sense, is giving a little allusion to that legend, which was very popular. But he does something beautiful. He uses a different word. The word for a boulder or a rock that could roll along would be petras, the masculine form of the noun. But he doesn't use that word. And that, I think, is a play on the legend. He uses petra, which means a massive cliff. And a massive cliff can't roll along behind the children of Israel. Well, what he says is this. You think that Israel's water, according to the legend, some think that Israel's water was supplied by a rolling boulder. But I'll tell you, they were drinking from the spiritual rocky mass, the rocky cliff, and that followed them was Christ. Listen, he says, you know what sustained Israel in the wilderness? It wasn't a rolling boulder, it was Christ. That's what he's saying. It was the Messiah. You say, you mean the Messiah was identified with his people even before his death? Of course. They were his people then. The supernatural rock that never allowed Israel to perish wasn't a rolling boulder. It was Christ himself accompanying his people through the wilderness. And here you see what Paul is saying is, look, they had what you have. They had the sustaining presence of the Messiah. People say, well, the Old Testament people, they didn't have the indwelling spirit. You're right, they didn't. But they had the sustaining presence of the Messiah. In those days, he was often called the angel of what? Of the Lord. The angel of Jehovah. But he was there. He was there sustaining his people. He was there caring for his people. He was there fulfilling his people's needs. Beautiful. Pre-existent Christ was there. And so he's saying to the Corinthians, you have it too. You've been set free as a witnessing community. You've been identified in that community under the headship of Jesus Christ. You are all feeding on the same spiritual food and the same spirit-given drink. And you are being sustained in it all by Christ, and they had those same privileges. You say, what's the point, Paul? The point is verse 5, and it comes like a shock. But with many of them, God was not well pleased, and they were overthrown in the wilderness. You see it? What a shocker. All those resources, liberated, called as a witnessing community, sustained and guided, sustained by God's provision, guided by God's cloud. They all had it, and even Christ himself was giving them those benefits. Do you notice verse 5, with many of them? The literal Greek is most of them. With most of them, God was not well pleased.